Good evening. Welcome to an evening with General Stanley McChrystal. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education here at the International Spy Museum. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Our Executive Director, Costa, is interviewing General McChrystal, the former commander of the International Security Assistance Forces in Afghanistan. The general has recently written on character, choices that define a life. The book is the culmination of the general's deep reflection on living true to one's ideals as he looks back upon a remarkable military career. And I know so many of you here have known him over the years, so that feels very privileged to be part of this conversation this evening. Now, over to the stars of the show. Chris, please take it away.
Hey, thanks a lot, Amanda. I'll try to call you Stan. I've been warned. I've never done that before. You twice, right? So it is a pleasure and a privilege to have you. We had a chance to chat up here on the stage, and it was great getting caught up with you. But the purpose tonight is to talk about a really important book on character. So I'm going to dive in, but before that, I think it's really important for me to provide some additional context to our audience and also offer the fact that I think I have an advantage talking to you this evening because although I wasn't in your inner circle in Baghdad in particular or in Afghanistan, I traveled in the same circles and I saw you lead. I was hosted oftentimes by your task force and I spent a lot of time there eating your food and sleeping in your billets. We won't say how we referred to those people in this setting, but I certainly spent a lot of time watching you, and that was a great privilege. I will also add for our audience, especially for those of you who are interested in hearing about counterterrorism and some spying, that might get worked in, but really you revolutionized the way that U.S. Special Operations Forces prosecuted the CT campaign, the counterterrorism campaign, and I watched that, and throughout all of that, it was your leadership that I honed in on. And at the same time, again, for this special audience, you had a mastery of intelligence that I had never seen from a ground commander before. So that is a little bit of a backdrop before we dive into some of the questions. And I want to say I didn't only have the luxury of watching you. We talked about a few of these officers, Admiral McRaven, John Mulholland, H.R. McMasters. It sounds like a law firm, right? McMaster. But anyway, watching all of you in combination was a great advantage that I had. So you sort of set out the problem statement right up front. You talk about the idea that we're due, mankind, so it's a big, meaty, weighty issue, we're due for an enlightenment. Right? That means we should learn and reflect on some philosophers from the past. And you talk about philosophy, and you do it in a non-dry way, I might add. And you also set out what you suggest is the problem statement, and that is our national leaders are not the cause of the problem that we're dealing with. It's really a symptom of a broader problem. And I love the way you framed it, and that is we don't think, we don't talk, and we don't demand character. And I think that's really important, and that rolls into my first big question right up front. What prompted you to write this book at this point in your life?
Yeah, well, let me start by thanking you, Chris, for being here and for advising everyone, if you ever do something like this, get a really close friend to do it with you. And the other thing is, if you don't have a sense of humor, you've got Chris and I and Norwich Grad and West Pointer talking about the Enlightenment up here. I mean, that's absurd, particularly if you know us. But in the audience, I don't know who's on the virtual audience, but in this room, there are some really serious people. People who have done some amazing things because I got to watch them do it. And then other people that I didn't get to watch it directly, but I heard about it and know what you did. And so let me start by thanking all of those people and their families and everyone connected. Because actually in this room, there's probably more practical difficult experience than you could ever get in a room this size. And so my thanks for that. And thanks for, the honor of being a part of it and the memories. And of course, that's what makes it special to do this. So thanks for the opportunity to talk about the book. I was done writing books. The story is I came out of the military. You guys remember, well, those of you who are old enough to remember, I came out when Rolling Stone wrote an article about me and my command team. And it wasn't the article anybody wants, and the title was The Runaway General. So as soon as you see that, you go, well, this isn't good. So I left the service, and I got out, and I was, kind of hurt and embarrassed and all that. And they came to me and they said, you need to write a book. And I go, I don't need to write a book. I don't want to write a book. And they go, you have a debt to history. I said, I don't have a debt to anybody. Then they said, we'll give you a bunch of money. I said, okay. Let's write this book. So I wrote my memoir, and that was great. Spent 2.5 years. And the humbling part about writing about your memoir is when you actually study what you did and you're the star in your mind and you do all the interviews, you find out you made a decision, and what your decision was not the thing that made it succeed or fail. It was all the other work of other people. So you realize you're not even the star of your own story. So I finished the memoir, came out, and I said, okay, good. And then the publisher says, the real book is part of the memoir, so you need to tease that out. So anyway, we wrote the book, Team of Teams, and then I really wanted to write a history book about leaders, so we wrote one on leaders. And then I wanted to write a book about risk, because I didn't know anything about risk, so we wrote a book about risk, me and a young lady. And so I was done. And so Annie and I like to sit in our living room and read. That's what we do. Other people have active lives, so we sit in our living room and read. And it's pretty good, 48 years doing that. And so I would interrupt her and I'd go, hey, let me tell you what I think about this. And she'd kind of go, okay, great. And then finally one day she goes, why don't you just write this stuff down? Kind of like, don't bother me. So I started writing a series of essays down about just random topics. And then I called her bluff and I gave them to her. And she goes, this is a book. I said, no, it's random essays. In fact, the title of this collection was going to be What I Think About the Things I Think About. I thought it was brilliant. It was clever. Yeah, right. Publisher didn't think so either. So, but it turned out to be that what I was thinking about at this age of my life was actually all related to character. And it wasn't planned. It was, I wrote about my marriage, I wrote about my granddaughters, I wrote about difficult moments in my life, I wrote about Afghanistan, I wrote about Gettysburg. I wrote about all these different things, and what I found is they all intersected at the thing that turned out to be the most important thing of all, which is character. It was never what you knew, it was never, the organization. At the end of the day, it was the character of the people that you interacted with, you relied on. And I mean, it's sort of late in life to come to that revelation, but I come to this revelation that the only thing that matters is character. And so the book really became my exploration of what I think about character. And it specifically is designed not to tell anyone else what to think about character. In fact, it invites people to think for themselves. And I have a line in there where I say, the next time you begin a sentence with the words, I think, make sure you did. Because we tend to repeat what pundits say on TV or what we hear, what we read, and just sort of regurgitate it. And I think that if we could step back and think, we do better. So I'm sort of urging everybody to think about it. For me, it was a journey just to think about all this stuff and to reach some conclusions, but also to understand where I still haven't reached a conclusion, where it's still not done, and where I'm trying to still decide what I think and who I am. And that's, again, it's probably late to need, but that's where I am.
Well, I think we're going to dive a whole lot deeper and explore some of the concepts that you talk about, because I think they're important. But the one question, completely original, although I will tell you, I went to AI and I got 2 different answers, frankly. So that said, I'm going to take a little risk, and I'm going to ask you a kind of a random question, but it's related to your military upbringing, our collective military upbringing for those who are veterans in the room. And Clausewitz wrote a book called On War, where he explored deeply the essence and nature of warfare. You took a different tact, and you're exploring self. It's looking at an individual, looking at the essence of a person's identity. So did that factor into the naming? That's the one question that I haven't seen anyone ask you.
Yeah, it did.
Okay.
I mean, I had studied that book. Most of us use Clausewitz as a sort of a touch point for where we went. And so it did, because his title was, in some ways, very humble. It says, On Warfare. It doesn't say, this is warfare, this is how to do it. And hopefully I'm not saying this is character and how to do it. I'm just saying, this is what I think about it.
That's right. You make the point. This isn't a prescription. This is, everybody's on their own journey. I think that's really important to say up front. I really appreciated that. So transitioning to another question, you tell a story that resonates with special forces officers or, frankly, anyone sitting with the locals. You tell the story, the vignette of Pashtun elders in Afghanistan. I love that story. Any humaniter can relate to it, or somebody that served in Afghanistan. And you talk about the different worldviews, and yet, despite different cultures at play and the barriers to communication, you saw the they playing out, and you offered an interesting vignette and observation. Could you talk to the audience about that?
Sure. There was an election in Afghanistan in summer 2009, and President Karzai had won convincingly, but there was a lot of accusations of corruption and whatnot. In any place like that, there's going to be an awful lot of it. So Senator Levin came over to visit, and I'd gotten along with him pretty well from the counterterrorist days. He'd come visit, but he wanted to go down and talk to people, and so we went down to Helmand Province, was one of the most problematic areas in southern Afghanistan. And we go down to an area that was still contested, and we have this meeting with about 50 Afghan elders, and it's in a room. We're all sitting on the floor because there was no furniture or anything like that. But this is a group of impressive, imposing guys. You know, even the guys who were 25 looked 50, you know, just kind of weathered, and they all got turbans on. And so we're speaking through an interpreter and hearing things through an interpreter. And Senator Levin sitting next to me, and he's a lawyer, and he's pretty direct, and he goes, okay, I saw the returns from this district, and President Karzai got all the votes. How is that democracy? And I kind of, okay, I'm looking for the exit. And the interpreter interprets it, says it to him, and there's all this talk among the group. They're looking at each other, and I'm thinking, we're dead. And then one of them stands up, and he starts talking, and we're getting it through the interpreter, and he says, well, we knew there was an election coming. We knew there were possibilities. We got together, and we talked about it, and we decided that Karzai was best for us, and it made no sense, since we figured out what we thought, to split our vote. How is that not democracy? And I sat there thinking, and sometimes people understand in a purer way than we do things that we think we invented, and we didn't invent it. And because they don't speak English, and they have a different language, different culture, and they're wearing hats that are unfamiliar to us, you start to think, well, these people don't think as well as we do. Well, they've been living in a very difficult environment and doing pretty well. And so it's a great reminder when you go through that. And then just to segue off of what you said, when you're sitting across with someone who's so physically and obviously different, you sort of click your mind and say, okay, I've got to think about this. I've got to understand the difference. But I also found you'd sit across, a DOD person would sit across from a U.S. Department of State member, and you say, well, they're Americans. Because they're Americans and we speak English and they got the same culture as us, we're speaking the same language, we're aligned. Not so. They didn't wear turbans, but the reality was we had vastly different journeys to where we were. And so two people with just the same good intentions, just the same basic good values, just have different perspectives. And it's easy to be dismissive. It's easy to say, well, that person just doesn't get it. Well, if you travel their route, you see it that way too.
So you talk about that in terms of a point of danger. I mean, you just offered the example of how for a second there or a couple minutes it must have seemed like a dangerous situation. So you segued into a really, really serious topic, and it was about the erosion or the idea that national character seems to be eroding, and that's the broader or greater danger. I know it's a super serious topic, but I think it's important for us to address, to hear from you. Can you talk a little bit about national character eroding?
I feel very serious about this one, and what I'm trying to do with the book and with some of the events we're doing is start a national conversation on character. Not so that people start with an answer that's given to them, but so that we start talking about character, because we don't now. If you think about it, when's the last time you actually heard someone talk about character other than using it very briefly going, that's got bad character? When's the last time a candidate or a leader said, I have good character and let me convince you why I have good character? We just kind of don't do that. So I think the challenge operates on a number of levels. I think on a first level, on an individual level, we don't think and demand enough of ourselves on character. And I can't blame it on anybody, but I think in the last few decades, there are fewer norms that sort of force us into displaying character. If you think about it, when you're young, maybe your parents told you to be polite, stand up straight, do this, whatever it is they did. Your school, your church, those groups demanded a certain level of behavior. You couldn't just be exactly what you wanted to be because they had something you wanted to be. And in some ways you say, well, that's the man trying to make me something I'm not. That's actually, I think, society trying to sand off some of the rough edges on all of us so that we fit together better. And then when you go, and often we start to convince ourselves it's okay because other people don't show good character. We would be chumps if we did. They did an experiment years ago, I remember, as they checked, and it involved bringing people in and having them do fill out a questionnaire, but there was money left on the table unguarded. And the real test was who took the money and who didn't. And there were a bunch of people who took the money and a bunch of people who didn't take the money. They asked some of them, and they go, some of the people who took it said, I'd been stupid not to take the money. There was nobody guarding it. I need to take the money. I'm almost required to take the money because I can take the money. And so on an individual level, I think that we have started to say that it's okay not to show a level of character that was more traditional in nature. And I think I understand certain things, but I think it's important: integrity, respect for others, sense of duty, all those things. They're not cheap ideas to anyone in this room, I'll bet. But to society, they've been weakened. If you expand that to an organizational or societal level, I think we are more hesitant to tell anybody else that they're not acting right. If you think about it, you go somewhere and somebody starts acting a fool, we're very embarrassed. We're hesitant to go up and say, stop it. Maybe if they're in our family or something, but in a public thing, we're very reticent to do that because it's sort of their right. Plus, we're worried we're going to get a response that we don't want. And if nobody says, stop it, How do people know when not to do stuff? I mean, what is the force? And so a society only works if people follow a certain number of rules. If you think about it, rule of law, respect for others, the willingness not to kill, do things. We take all those for granted, but in reality, they're the only thing that let us function normally. Otherwise, we'd be at home in little fortresses worried about everybody who's coming around us. So we establish these norms, and when we allow the character of the society to degrade, when those norms aren't respected, suddenly it becomes a more difficult, a more dangerous, a less productive place. And I think we have to have the courage to say that a level of character is required, and that violating a certain level of character disqualifies you for certain things, for certain positions of responsibility. If we can't trust you, I don't want to give you the keys to where we keep the weapons. And it gets as simple as that sometimes. And so I think it's important that we step back and go, this isn't philosophical, this is practical.
So I don't even like asking this question. I promise we're going to talk about loincloths in 495, so bear with me. If you know what I'm talking about, you'll enjoy. But I want to follow up because it seems that there's a societal shift towards it's about me.
Yeah.
What's in it for me? So you can ask the question, does it matter anymore what the nation stands for, what America stands for? As I said, I hesitate to ask that question, but it does beg the question, where are we? And does it matter anymore? Can you address that?
I think it does, and I think most of us think it does, but it's not popular to say it does. You know, every once in a while you hear veterans or people who do things like that are actually suckers because they fell for, somebody asked them to go to war, so they went, and they got shot up. Well, that was stupid. And you step back and go, wait a minute, we asked them to go. It wasn't stupid. It was exactly what we asked. So I think when we let our society allow that, I think that's a mistake. So I think it's important that we have the courage. Again, I'm not trying to put values in a corset. I'm not trying to say that, you know, a certain set of religious values or wherever but there is a left and right limit to values. There are things that are out of bounds, and inside that there needs to be plenty of room to breathe, to debate, to talk. But there are things you do and you don't do. And we need to be willing to call that.
So can you provide some examples from your career, specifically examples that shaped your understanding of character? I think it would be worth sharing that with the audience, and you had some great examples in the book.
Yeah. There are times, and I'll talk about, you know, individual character, when somebody is sort of stunning. You know, I would describe that, you know, I live in Old Town Alexandria. If you go just a little bit north, you get to Reagan Airport. And if everyone here has probably flown in and out of Reagan many times, and if you made the mistake of checking luggage, you go to the baggage carousels. And if you go to get your baggage, invariably, in my case, everybody is packed shoulder to shoulder, right up to the carousel with their knees on it, trying to get their bag first, even though the bags haven't come up yet. And they've got this theory that if they wait close enough, that their bag will come out earlier, forgetting that the people down below don't know or care where you are. But nobody else can see. So everybody else is standing behind trying to see when the bags are coming out. When your bag comes out, you got to push somebody out of the way. And you say, well, wow, every flight I'm on is full of a bunch of jerks. Well, that's statistically not the case. They're probably great people. But instead, they're jammed up next to this carousel in a way that is selfish to other people. And you say, well, why are they doing that? I think they're doing that because we allow it, and because they think that they're never going to meet those people again. They're going to get their bag because they're tired, they're going to go home, and then they're going to be a wonderful person. They're going to be around people they know, and they're going to be thoughtful and do all of those things. But in that moment, they are anonymously selfish. Okay. Well, then we stop and say, are we ever guilty of that? And undoubtedly, all of us at some point are guilty of something like that. And so you say, well, wow, that could be me, and that maybe that is me a lot. And you say, well, people are bad. Well, if you go just north of that, you go to 14th Street Bridge. That's actually not the name of the bridge. The bridge is named Alvin William Bridge. Most of us don't know that. But in the 1980s, an Air Florida aircraft on a cold winter day didn't de-ice properly. And as it took off, it couldn't get enough altitude, and the tail clipped the 14th Street Bridge. The aircraft pitched into the water. It was 34 degrees out. It was during rush hour in the early morning. And there was ice in the river. It wasn't iced over, but there was ice in the river. And 79 people go in with this aircraft. 73 are killed immediately. 6 survive, and they're clinging to the tail of the aircraft, the wreckage of the tail. Some people try to go out and get them. One person tries to swim out, another tries to wade out, but it's just too cold. You can't do it. And so these people are clinging for about 20 minutes in this icy water. They can't get in. Nobody can get out and get them. Then a helicopter comes. Not a rescue-designed helicopter, but a helicopter with a capability and a cable with a loop at the end. And some of you will remember the video of this. And 5 times the helicopter goes and it drops this cable, and an individual down in the water passes the cable to another passenger. The person's picked up, taken to the side, and ultimately survives. The 6th time they go back, the individual is gone. Now, the individual was turned out to be a guy named Alvin Williams. And he was a 46-year-old civil servant, a bureaucrat. He'd been divorced. He was about to get married again. Very, very average guy. In fact, his mother, when she was asked about him after the accident, it was found out what he'd done, she goes, he was average, just average. That's Mom. But if you think about it, if we start with the accepting the fact that she was right, he was just average, he wasn't that morning. That morning he showed the kind of character that I think we wish we would see in society. Now, would all of us do that? I don't know. It's hard to say. I can't say I would do that. I hope I would. But the point is, the same kind of people who are standing in front of the carousel, one or more of them might very well do exactly what Alvin Williams did. And that bridge might be named after them now. And so I'm not down on society. I think, in fact, what we've got is this unbelievable potential. I think people want to be better people, but they're not encouraged to be. Sometimes the support systems around me, when I went to West Point, it was 1972, and West Point was just kind of reflecting the U.S. Military Academy's place in the Army, which was struggling after Vietnam. And we had a honor code: a cadet would not lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate those who do. And it wasn't designed to make West Point a more honorable place. It was designed to produce people who, for the rest of their lives, would be more honorable and think more about it. And I think the idea of having support systems that make us better than we'd otherwise be is really, really important in our society. Think of prisoners of war in the Hanoi Hilton. James Stockdale wins the Medal of Honor for his courage in 7 years. But he had the great advantage of he'd studied philosophy. He was a little older. He was a little more mature. He had more to grab onto. And the prisoners who struggled most tended to be younger, less mature. They were less grounded. And because they separated people, you're doing that alone. And so I think character is something that we support each other with. Annie makes me a better person. And she's done that since the day we met. And if you can get a constellation of people around you to make better people, then we're all a little bit better.
So that's a powerful story, and that's a good segue to a formula you came up with the reminder that, this works differently for each individual, and this isn't a prescriptive book, as you pointed out, but you came up with a formula. Could you talk about the formula and how it applied to your own life?
Yeah, I was trained as an engineer, so of course it's a mathematical equation, although I'm terrible at math. But I came up with the belief that character is really the product of two things. It's the product of the convictions that we hold. Those are the deeply held beliefs, not the things that somebody tells us and we just nod, but the things we've thought about, right and wrong or whatever. Those are our convictions. We're willing to live to them or die for them. But then the other part of it is it's the product of that times the discipline we have to live to them. Because if you don't have the discipline to live to them, anything times zero is zero. You can talk to somebody and say, what's your character? And they can give you these unbelievably good convictions. And then you find that's not what they actually do. Because character is what we do. That's how you measure it. It's not what we think. It's not what we say or what we write. It's what we do. And sometimes we can even deceive ourselves. We can say, this is my character. And then you find yourself in the certain moments you're not doing what you thought you'd do. Sometimes you're pleasantly surprised and sometimes you're very disappointed. And so to me, the discipline part becomes as important as the convictions, maybe more important. And this is the part where each of us gets to choose every day what our character is. If you've been a lousy character your whole life, you could change that right this moment. You have agency, you own it. We all own it. We could change the character of our country tonight. All we'd have to do is nod and say, that's what we're going to do. And do it. That's the amazing part of it. That's also the hard part of it, because you actually got to do it. But that's the beauty of this. But I think sometimes we don't think about that enough. We think, okay, it's this way and I can't change it. Why?
So I want to set up the next question with a little personal insight, because you solved a problem for me, a small problem, and that was, how do I define for people why we selected, my family, a retirement home in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania? Everyone says, why Gettysburg? Why not Leesburg? Why not somewhere else? And I really struggle with that, but as we've talked about, Gettysburg is cathartic. It's a bit of a touchstone if you've been in the military, although it's not exclusively for the military. On the contrary, it's for all of us. But you really answered that question. And again, I'm sitting in my study reading on character, and I've got a print of Little Round Top, Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, just 4 miles from my study in Gettysburg. And I struggle with answering that question. And then I read your book, and you say Gettysburg is not just a place, it's an idea. I think it's really important to explain that to the American public. Why is it an idea? Why is it more than a place?
Yeah. And of course, Gettysburg is largely the meaning we give it. And so if we choose to give it important meaning, I think we can. Gettysburg was a battle 2.5 years into the Civil War. It's considered sort of the tipping point. After Gettysburg, it was unlikely that the South could win, although they might get a political settlement. But up to Gettysburg, it was unclear that the North could win either, simply because they were having so many challenges trying to deal with the Army of Northern Virginia. The people who went and fought at Gettysburg largely understood that. It was one of those things, early in the Civil War, everybody thought the first couple battles were going to decide it and we'd go home. 2.5 years in, they knew it was not going to be easy. And so most of the people who went and fought at Gettysburg were realistic at that point. They understood that if it went one way, it might very well be success for the South. If it went the other way, it wouldn't. So they understood the gravity of the moment, and yet they choose to be there. Most of them were volunteers because the early, as you'd say, Sunshine Patriots, Tom Paine would say, had left, and the draftees really hadn't started kicking in until after that period in the war. So it was largely volunteers, largely this Darwinistic process of producing leaders. So Gettysburg becomes this critical moment in American history. Potentially, the high water mark on Cemetery Ridge is the most decisive piece of terrain in American military history with the greatest import. You can stand there and the ground literally speaks to you. If you grew up in the military, you can immediately see the effect of the terrain. Even if you didn't, you can see enough to understand what it was like to have 150,000 people struggling there against each other, people with the same religion, same background, just different political viewpoints. For me, Gettysburg, for some reason, turned out to have a number of touch points in my life, and then I've intentionally used it ever since. I first went when I was 10 years old. My father had just gotten back from Vietnam, and my uncle had died. His sister's husband had died. So we went up there to coordinate him being buried in Gettysburg. He was a veteran in the cemetery. And my father used that trip up there to coordinate that, to take my brother and I and just sort of show us the battlefield. And that was fascinating to me. Then I didn't go again until I was a colonel in the Army, commanding the Ranger Regiment. And we took my senior leaders there, and we spent 2 days there and just sort of soaked up, did a commander's conference and soaked up the area. But then later, during the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, when I was commanding the counterterrorist force, we took the commanders and spouses to Gettysburg in 2005, in the summer of 2005. And we brought most of them back from the battlefields. We brought spouses in and whatnot. And we decided to spend 2.5 days there as a chance to talk about where we are and what are we doing. And while we're there, for those of you who've seen the movie Lone Survivor, when first the reconnaissance patrol is compromised and hit, and then the helicopter goes down, it happened when we were there. And we ran the rescue operation from the 3rd floor of the Gettysburg Hotel by satellite. Ed Winters running that, for those who remember, good friend Ed. And then I started, when I left the service, I started taking my Yale class every year. I taught leadership at Yale for 12 years, started taking them every year to Gettysburg. And these young people, most of them had no real appreciation for the Civil War. It just wasn't something that was emphasized as they were growing up. Almost none of them had ever been there. And although they're brilliant young people, they just didn't know much about it. And we didn't steep them in military history. We focused on leadership. But when you have them stand on the ground and you talk about young people making important decisions, you can suddenly see, all right, this has a meaning that in a history book, it's really hard to capture. And so I think that it's important that we sometimes leverage place to communicate ideas. I think this museum leverages history to communicate ideas. Because if you think about what the Spy Museum does, I mean, it's cool stuff. But the reality is that business is full of a bunch of dedicated professionals working in the shadows, often at great cost. And we've got to celebrate that, or we'll never get people in the future to appreciate it or do it.
No, thanks for saying that. That's important. And that's a perfect setup for the next question. And it's about character and intelligence. I wanted to make sure we talked a little bit about the relationship between some of the concepts you talked about in being an intelligence officer. So you only talked about one intelligence officer in your book, and his last name will remain anonymous, but it's a friend by the name of Greg. And you talk, again, here it comes, the loincloth and I-495. I'm going to let you tell that part of the story, if you will. But before I do that, I want to share with you a conversation I had with Greg that really goes out to those individuals that are in the intel community, and I would challenge them to give me feedback on this idea. But it's really for them, and there are some luminaries, I won't call them out. We've already talked to them tonight as they came in, that have been case officers out in the field with other agencies and DOD. I talked to Greg, and we concluded that we learned a lot of our business by being first rifle platoon leaders. Rifle platoon leaders, and we both, interestingly, went to private military colleges. You went to West Point, but we had that foundation, and then we had problem solving with infantrymen, young infantrymen, and problem solving was nonstop, as you well know. And all of that said, we learned tradecraft training, we were trained how to meet sources, et cetera, but really we had the foundation by problem solving as infantrymen. And then you talked about some concepts. When you sprinkle those concepts in, it really underscores the importance of things like empathy, which you talked about. You understood that when you were sitting with those Pashtun tribes and you shared that with the audience, listening, and leading through adversity, which you just alluded to. The adversity of running a rescue operation in Gettysburg, which I didn't know. That's a phenomenal story. And then you talked about one of my favorite quotes, embracing the suck. I'll let you describe that, which I think there's no better way to describe Ranger School. But also you suggested that it's pretty easy because all you have to do is not quit. So those concepts coming together really, with different circumstances, gave us the tools that we need. And that's going to lead into one big question, but I'd like you to address the loincloth 495 and talk a little bit about that observation.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know Greg Vogel, he was a Citadel graduate. My brother was his TAC officer at the Citadel.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And then he became a Marine officer, and then he went into the agency, served an incredible career, probably the most respected guy that I ever saw in the agency. And I met him in 2004, actually late 2003, when I took over JSOC. And I met this guy. He was the chief of station in Afghanistan. And he was extraordinary because we went up to meet Northern Alliance people. They were having a one-year anniversary for Massoud's murder. And so we went up there and did that, and that was good. And then we went on this tour, was a battlefield tour, where we went at night to visit a bunch of the bases along the border, and went in one of the old Mi-17 helicopters, and we're flying at night because it was dangerous. And we had, in these bases, we'd had several JSOC members and several agency guys, and then some Afghan troops. And the idea was to secure the border. And the idea was our people to work together, JSOC and CIA. And we went to one of the spaces, and we met with them, and we got briefings from them. And they weren't working together. And I got back in the helicopter. We stopped at about 4 that night. I was so angry I could have chewed nails. I just wanted to choke him. And Greg is with me, and he didn't know me well at that point. But he sits next to me in this helicopter, and he's got all his gear on, and he flips down his night vision goggles. He pulls out a little like platoon leader notebook, and he writes this thing down, and I'm going, what's this guy doing? He rips it out, and he hands it to me. And so I pull down my nods, and I read it. And I have it today framed on the office, in the wall in my office at home, because it's kind of scrawled. It says, to India 1-1, or to Capital One, which is my call sign. And it said, I don't know the Ranger Creed, but you can bet your sweet ass I'll never leave you. India 11, which was his call sign. And it was a promise. It was a thing is, you can trust me. And I barely knew this guy, but I took this thing and I stuck it in my pocket. I said, interesting. We've been damn near best friends ever since. That's more than 20 years ago. We were at Gettysburg this week and he gave me a copy of he gave me a t-shirt with Embrace the Suck on it. I should have worn it. But the story that Chris is talking about is Greg every once in a while will try to explain trust to people. And he'll say, listen, there are some people that if they call me at night and they say, I want you to go out on 495, the Beltway around D.C., stand on the side of the road in a loincloth, golf shoes, and a light coat of oil, he says, I will go do it. No questions asked. He says, that group is very small, but I'll do that. And what he's communicating is there are people with whom you build that level of trust if they call. And if you think about that, having even one person in your life who do that for you is an extraordinary gift and something you protect. And being that person for other people is something that you give a gift to. It means you got to live up to it. But the reality is, for people who understand that, who appreciate that you don't make that commitment lightly, but when you do, that it is sacred, it has real power. And when you get to know someone like Greg, who grants that sparingly, but does grant it, it's extraordinary.
So that also is a powerful story. Thanks for sharing that. I forgot about the light coat of oil, actually. So that's a detail that I
It gives a little additional picture to it, yeah.
That's right. So it's terrific. So we're running out of time, and I could stay here all night and listen to you. I want to make sure I ask a question that really relates to the aspiring public servants, especially at this time in our history. You know, what can they do? What are the practical things that they can do to start working on characters, to start thinking about it, to start forging the way, to become servant leaders? I think it's really important. And I have to tell you, we have a lot of young folks that listen to our programs. And could you talk to them for a minute?
Sure. I am working my way, and I'm enjoying it, Rick Atkinson's second volume of The Revolution. And if you think about people who chose to serve in the revolution, it was extraordinarily difficult. It was anything but a sure bet. And the population had significant percentage of loyalists, significant percentage of people who didn't care, and a percentage of, we call them revolutionaries, but there are people who sided with that. And to commit yourself to something like that was really hard. Because in many cases, you of course read the accounts of the founding fathers, almost all of them lost their property, lost their position, didn't come out of their support for the new nation richer or more powerful or anything. We tend to think of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, but most people who signed the Declaration, that turned out to be a disastrous step for them. But they did it. And then the people who went in the Continental Army and served, you know, they did it, and they made the commitment. We're in a tough, you know, this is my personal opinion. I'm not asking people to agree with me. We're at a difficult time in our country right now. We have a level of division in our country that is palpable. And whether you were on the left or right, it doesn't matter. You can see it, and you can feel it, and you know it's painful. And so young people who enter service now, it's not as unified as it might have once been. We go back to the Cold War. The war was a difficult place, but we generally all felt like there's bad guys on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and we're all over here doing this, and we may disagree on the how, but we didn't disagree on the what. And right now we're disagreeing a little bit on who we are. If you ask people to say, what is the United States? What should it be? I think we'd get a pretty wide spectrum of visions on it. And that just makes it hard because it's not clear. You don't immediately join in and people aren't patting you on the back and saying, yep, no. Instead, people are, what do you believe? What do you believe in? And so I think people who make the choice to serve now are entering a more complicated environment than most of the older people in this room we ever experienced. And we did hard stuff, but it was a little more straightforward. But we need people to serve. We need young people, we need middle people, we need old people to serve. We absolutely do. You know, and the solution is not to say, okay, the American experience or experiment died and we give up. Because what's the outcome there? That's the worst possible outcome. That everything we worked for 250 years comes to naught. It's like a marriage. You know, pretty periodically, Annie gets off the rails and I gotta pull her back on. But yeah, who's gonna guard me going home? But
We'll get you an Uber.
But if you give up on it, the worst of all possible things happens, it fails. So you can't. And you say, well, it's not going to work. Okay. Stick with it until it doesn't work. And then keep sticking with it even after that, because you don't have another option. We don't have another United States of America. There's not a place we step to and, okay, we'll do this. Nah, this is it. We're all in a family. If you got a dysfunctional family like mine, they're still your family. And so that's where I think about people serving now. And we also got to think about tomorrow. I remember we were in Iraq during the really tough part of the war, and a British officer who's a close friend of Greg and mine, Sir Graham Lamb, who was in the counter-terrorist fight, and it was pretty intense. And he goes, okay, Stan, I want you to release Abu Bag of Donuts so we can negotiate with him. I said, you want to negotiate with him? Come on up. I got him in a cell. You can negotiate right there. And he said, a person can't negotiate from a cell. You got to let him go so that we can negotiate with him. And at first I was going, but he was right, because at some point you realize there's a tomorrow, and the people that you disagree with now are going to be your friends, your allies, your fellow citizens tomorrow. And so it's sometimes hard to do that. But it's always necessary to do that. And I think that's the mindset we have to take right now. You know, when Annie gets her head straight, you should be fine. Wow. Gutsiest move you ever saw, right?
So what I'd like to do now, that I appreciate your message to the public servants, our future public servants and those young folks that are listening. Amanda, let's take a few questions, and I know that we'll wrap up, and I've got some final comments, but I'm going to turn it over to you.
I welcome anyone in the audience live to go to that microphone, and in the meantime, I will ask, we've got a few questions online, but please make your way over there. I don't want to dominate. Is there a high water mark in the past of character?
I don't think so. I think that we may look at certain periods and we see a vision or a version of history that makes us think the character. We go back to the founding fathers and we go, wow, there's these amazing soaring personalities. Well, they're the ones we write about and read about, and there were an awful lot of people who weren't that. There was also periods where society was much more, at least on the surface, was much more demanding of character. But we know that beneath the surface there were people and things that were going on that were not. So I don't think that even when we had periods where, religious fervor would go up and down, I think there's a perception that, no, it was better. I think you could probably say on average, we had better thought about character or more thought about character. Let's put it that way. It was something people considered more. And so I think that people are people, but I think considering it more is almost half the battle. And so that's what the comparison I'd make.
Sir, please.
Hey, thank you, sir. Charlie Pino, I'm currently an Army officer, JAG, and thank you for this opportunity to learn from you. Something I want to ask you about is the dilemma you face. And I think, as I read through your book and listened to what you said, I think you took responsibility and not blame. And there's a difference. I'm a lawyer, so words mean something. And so when I look at that, and I said, you took responsibility, because I believe character and what you're talking about, your mindset is there's something bigger than us, and it's our nation, it's our Constitution, and who we are today. And I think so much of where we're at today is we've lost that, the concept of the citizen, that concept of there's something bigger than us, and that's what keeps us together. That's what makes our nation great. And so someone who didn't just write about it, but lived it, not only lived it, but changed their life. I've dealt with Army officers who, because of a misstep or a missed word, went from thinking of they're getting ready to take command at the next level to, I got to go buy a new set of golf clubs. And so you faced that. And when you made that decision to take responsibility, you had the option and you didn't have to. So how do we today, where we're at, how do we get back to that we teach that next generation, that taking responsibility, sometimes falling on your sword for the bigger picture is the key of what we need to do to move on.
Well, you're kind to say that. You certainly give me the great benefit of the doubt, and I appreciate it. He's referring to when I resigned from the service based on the magazine article. And it is true. I didn't feel guilty of anything. I didn't feel like I didn't think that the article was accurate. But I absolutely knew that as the commander, I was responsible. And this painful article comes on my boss, the commander-in-chief's desk, and I'm responsible for that. And I'm not supposed to let that happen. And so people say, wasn't it a difficult decision? I go, it wasn't a difficult decision at all. It was an easy decision. From the moment I read the article, I knew what was going to happen. It was still painful because I knew the consequences, and I also knew, or let me put it this way, it took me, I don't know, within a few hours, but pretty quickly, I also knew that it was a decision that I was going to live with. When you have a decision like that, you get choices. And I've described this before, but I came back to the United States, met with the president, offered my resignation. He accepts it, and I'm done. And I drive back across the city to Fort McNair, where Annie was living. And I walk in and tell her, okay, my career's over. He's accepted my resignation. And I'd just flown back from Afghanistan. So, obviously we had not been together for quite a long time. And she looked at me and she said, good. We've always been happy and we'll always be happy. And what she did in that moment, she communicated, okay, we are moving forward, not back. I always joke that I said she lives life like she drives with no use for the rearview mirror. Yeah. But it was the most important thing anyone has ever done in my life, because she just says, we're not going to argue about it. We're not going to whine about it. We're not even going to whisper in bed at night, we're victims. We got screwed. We've never had that conversation in 15 years since that. We just don't. What we have is the conversation, okay, what are we doing now? Where are we going? And that was liberating. But it was reflexive in the moment. Reflexive, I think, on her part, and certainly on my part, was sort of revelational. Because it was, if I'd walked in and said that, then she'd go, oh, you got screwed. We need to call people. We need to fight this. We need to whatever. I might have done that. But she didn't. And so that's when I think the gift of somebody who like having a really good lawyer. You know, I used to have a lawyer in JSOC. I'd come up, I'm a very clever person. So I'd come up with clever plans. And his seat in our situation, you remember Rich Gross, it's right kind of behind me and over my right shoulder. And I'd be going, we should do this. And then I'd hear, I'd turn around and he'd go, no, we're not doing that. And you need that. So thanks very much.
We have time for another one, Amanda.
Yeah, I would like this gentleman to ask, and then there's a very cool one that I'd kind of like to ask as a last question.
I'll be rather simple. So H.L. Mencken has a quote that says, "For every complex problem, there is an answer that is simple, clear, and wrong." So as you've worked in a very complex environment, and right now we have an issue of the narrative is the easy answer. Here's the easy answer of these things. How would you, in your book, in your description, how do we tell people, no, there are more complex problems, there's more going on than what you see, and how do we tell people, keep looking more? It's not that easy.
Boy, yeah. He's right about most things, and he nailed it there. And if I was going to get political tonight, on both sides, the challenge is people try to simplify. If you ask me tonight, what do we do about problem X in the world? And I'm in front of a normal group, this is a very different group, and I said, we need to go bash those people, I'd get an applause line. If I said, you know, that's a complicated problem, and there are two views of that, and this is something we really got to consider, there'd be dead silence. And people would go, you know, that guy can't decide what he wants to do. And so this is one of the great challenges we have, particularly with the way our media works now. It plays to the very simple, and it plays to the two-dimensional, and it plays to the binary. And so the idea that, you know, hey, this is what we're going to do is seductive, but just disastrous. And so I don't know how we really solve that unless we get to the point where we realize we should hire leaders, elect leaders for their wisdom and judgment. And we don't want them to be a superconductor to us. I don't want the electorate, me included, to be able to get a hold of the people I've elected and say, damn it, do X. Because I'm not spending all my time thinking about it, getting educated on it, debating it, and considering it. We have a representative form of government with the whole idea is we elect good people that hopefully will figure it out, be more informed, and do the right thing. And if they just do what we scream, you know, we don't think that much. And so I think your point could not be more appropriate. Thank you.
All right, last one from online. I think this is really interesting. Are there any other places in your life that are tied to an idea?
Yeah. West Point. I always wanted to go to West Point because my dad went there. And I almost got thrown out. Some of you guys know. And it's interesting. I did, and I came within that close, get thrown out my sophomore year for misconduct. And I richly deserved it. But the place and, well, people that were at the place made the decision not to make that happen. It was a combination of several people that made decisions that could have shaved it one way and I'd be gone, and they didn't. And so when I think about West Point, it's not that it is a sacred monument. It is a place where if they get it right, and if you get it right, you go there and you come out better. Some of that takes a long time to actually show up. But I think that it represents the effort to do that. It's not the only place, but it's the one I know. So, thanks.
Thank you. All right. Chris Costa, what are your final remarks before my final remarks?
I just want to thank Stan, which crushes me to
Well
say
done.
Stan. Thank you for doing this. You know, your leadership was inspired, and I know you don't like hearing that, but I appreciate the modeling that you did. I appreciate the book that you wrote. It's important to start a national conversation on these ideas, and I really appreciate hearing about Annie and how she factored into your life. That's very universal for military families, and we were both lucky. So I thank you for sharing that, Annie. I thank you. It's important to share those stories, and others will follow. Thank you very much for doing this. I'm very grateful to have you here this evening. And I just want to thank our audience as well. And I'll turn it back to Amanda. This is an incredible audience, both here and our virtual audience. Thank you all. We wouldn't be the Spy Museum without the support of the people in this room and our virtual guests and our amazing team. Amanda, over to you.
Please check our website calendar to see what's happening next. Thank you for spending the evening with us.